Mumbai, a city that never truly sleeps. Even at 2 a.m., you'll find life on its streets, vendors closing shop, workers returning home, and hundreds sleeping under the open sky. For many, these streets aren't temporary, they are home. But in the mid-1980s, something changed. Because when the city went quiet, someone else was awake. Not a thief, not a robber, something far more disturbing. A killer who didn't chase victims, didn't break doors, didn't leave warnings. He waited, watched, and when the moment was right, he struck. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, the city was already in the grip of fear. Pause. Because this wasn't just murder, this was something colder, something methodical, and it would soon be known as the work of the Stoneman. It began quietly, almost invisibly. One morning, a man was found dead on a Mumbai pavement. To most people, this wasn't unusual. Poverty, exhaustion, illness, death on the streets was not uncommon. But when authorities looked closer, something felt wrong. There were no signs of illness, no natural cause. Instead, there was trauma, severe trauma. His skull had been crushed, not in a fight, not in self-defense, but while he slept. No witnesses, no sounds, no struggle, just a body and silence. At the time, it was treated as an isolated incident, but it wasn't. Days later, another body was found. Different location, same condition, sleeping on the pavement. Head crushed. Again, no witnesses. Now police began to pay attention. 2 deaths, same pattern, same brutality. Coincidence or something else? Pause. Before they could answer that question, a third body appeared, then a fourth, and suddenly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The victims had nothing in common. Except one thing. They were all sleeping outside. Homeless men, laborers, people invisible to most of society, attacked at night, killed in their sleep. No resistance, no witnesses, which raised a terrifying question. Was the killer choosing victims who couldn't fight back, or worse, victims no one would notice? Then came the most chilling discovery. The weapon wasn't a knife or a gun. It was something far more ordinary. A stone, large, heavy, brutal, picked from the street, used once and abandoned, which meant no fingerprints, no trail, no connection. The weapon was everywhere, and nowhere. Pause. Anyone could pick up a stone. Anyone could become the killer. As bodies continued to appear, fear began to spread, not through official warnings, but through whispers, rumors. Stories passed from one person to another. Don't sleep alone. Stay in groups. Something is happening at night. People who had slept on the streets for years now stayed awake. Some formed groups. Others avoided certain areas. But no one knew where the killer would strike next, because there was no pattern of location, only a pattern of victims, and that made it even more terrifying. Police increased patrols, more officers, more presence at night, but it didn't help. Because the killer wasn't leaving clues. No witnesses, no survivors, no sightings. It was as if he appeared and disappeared without a trace, which led to a disturbing thought. What if the killer didn't stand out at all? What if he blended in, looked like everyone else, walked the same streets, passed by unnoticed? As the fear grew, the media stepped in, and they gave the killer a name, the Stoneman, and suddenly, the unknown had an identity. Headlines spread the story. A killer targeting the homeless, striking at night, leaving no trace. The city was now fully aware and fully afraid. Who was he? Why these victims? Why at night? Why no witnesses? And the biggest question of all, how was he getting away every single time? Because in a city like Mumbai, complete silence is rare. Yet somehow, he killed, again and again, without anyone hearing a thing. Experts began to analyze the pattern. This wasn't random violence. It showed control, timing, selection, which suggested something chilling. The killer wasn't acting out of impulse. He was choosing his victims, studying them, waiting for the right moment, which meant he wasn't just dangerous, he was patient. By now, the streets had changed. People no longer slept peacefully. Every shadow felt suspicious. Every sound felt amplified, because the danger wasn't visible. It was silent, and it came without warning. Pause. And just when the fear reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The killings continued. The attacks didn't stop. They increased. What once felt like isolated incidents now became a pattern of terror. Bodies were found more frequently, different streets, different neighborhoods, but always the same method. Sleeping victims, crushed skulls, no witnesses. And now, the city could no longer ignore it. This was not random. This was a serial killer. Pause. And he was getting bolder. The fear spread beyond the homeless. People who lived in small roadside homes began locking doors earlier. Street vendors packed up before midnight. Night workers looked over their shoulders. Because the question was no longer, who is the victim? It became, who's next? And the worst part? There was no safe zone. The attacks didn't follow a fixed location. No predictable route, no clear territory, which meant the killer could be anywhere. Authorities intensified their efforts. More patrols, more checkpoints, more officers on the streets at night. Undercover surveillance began. Officers dressed as civilians, watching, waiting, hoping to catch the killer and to act. But the result? Nothing. No arrests, no sightings, no leads. It was as if the killer knew exactly how to avoid them. Think about it. The victims were asleep, which means the killer had time to approach, time to observe, time to choose. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting for the perfect moment. And that raises a chilling possibility. Was he watching his victims before they slept, or worse, was he already among them, blending in, unnoticed? Now, fear turned into panic. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the killer had supernatural abilities. Others believed he was part of a group. Some even claimed he wasn't human at all. Because how else could someone kill again and again without being seen? Ha! Narrator. When fear takes over, logic begins to disappear. A disturbing realization emerged. The victims were not random. They were chosen, not for who they were, but for what they represented. Isolation, vulnerability, invisibility, people who lived on the margins of society, people who, if they disappeared, wouldn't immediately trigger alarms, pause, which led to a painful truth. The killer had found victims. The system struggled to protect. Despite increased efforts, the investigation began to stall. No forensic evidence, no reliable witnesses, no surviving victims. And with each passing day, pressure grew. Media questioned the police. Public demanded answers, but answers never came. Instead, the case became more complicated, more confusing, and more frustrating. Some believed the killer had come dangerously close to being caught, but slipped away. Because in such cases, timing is everything. One wrong patrol route, one missed observation, and the opportunity disappears forever. Narrator. Sometimes, it's not what you don't know, but what you almost knew that matters the most. Police tried new tactics. They increased visibility in known sleeping areas, encouraged people to move into groups, even attempted to predict the killer's pattern. But there was one problem. There was no pattern, at least not one they could identify, which made the killer even more dangerous. Because unpredictability is impossible to defend against. This was the height of the crisis. The city was alert. The police were active. The media was watching. And still, the killings continued, which meant one thing. The killer was not afraid. Not of the police, not of the public, not even of being caught. And that made him even more terrifying. At this point, people stopped asking just who. They began asking why. Why kill strangers? Why choose the defenseless? Why strike at night? Was it rage, control, compulsion, or something deeper? Something we may never fully understand. And then, just as suddenly as the fear had risen, something changed. The killings began to slow, then stopped. No announcement, no arrest, no explanation, just silence, pause, and that silence was just as terrifying as the murders themselves, because it left one final question. Did the killer leave, or is he still out there, unseen? And then it ended. No warning, no final attack, no dramatic capture, just silence. The killings stopped. After weeks of fear, after multiple lives lost, after an entire city on edge. The Stoneman disappeared. Pause. But the fear didn't. Because when something like this ends without explanation, it doesn't feel over. It feels unfinished. The streets slowly returned to normal. People began sleeping outside again. Vendors reopened late into the night. But something had changed. There was hesitation, a lingering doubt, because no one knew why it stopped. And more importantly, no one knew if it could start again. The first theory seemed simple. The killer moved. Mumbai was no longer his hunting ground. Maybe he shifted to another city, blended into another crowd, started again somewhere else. But there was a problem. No similar pattern of killings appeared elsewhere. At least, none that could be confirmed. Another possibility: the killer was arrested. Not for these murders, but for something else. A different crime, a different case. And now, he sat in prison, unknown, unrecognized. The Stoneman, caught, but never identified. Some believed the killer simply died. An accident, an illness, something sudden, and with him, the truth disappeared forever. Because if the killer is gone, the story ends without answers. This is perhaps the most unsettling theory of all. He chose to stop, not because he was caught, not because he had to, but because he wanted to, which suggests something chilling. The killings weren't out of control. They were controlled, deliberate, meaning the killer could decide when to begin and when to end. Serial offenders often follow patterns: escalation, compulsion, repetition. But this case breaks that pattern, because it ended abruptly, which raises a critical question. Was this truly a serial killer, or something else entirely? A series of calculated acts, with a hidden motive, or a mind that simply moved on? Let's consider something even more disturbing. What if the killer was never hidden? What if he lived a normal life, walked the same streets, worked a regular job, spoke to people every day, and no one suspected a thing because he didn't look dangerous? He didn't act unusual. He was ordinary. Pause. Sometimes, the most terrifying people are the ones who don't stand out at all. Why the homeless? Why people sleeping on the streets? There are possible explanations. They were accessible. They were vulnerable. They were unlikely to resist. But there's another possibility. They were invisible. People society often overlooks, which made them easy targets and harder to avenge. No arrests, no confirmed suspects, no clear motive, which means no closure for the victims, for the city, for history. And that's what makes this case different. Not just the violence, but the absence of answers. Even after the killing stopped, the story didn't disappear. It became urban legend, a warning, a reminder. That danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks quietly beside you, unnoticed, until it's too late. So we return to the same question. Who was the Stoneman? A calculated killer, a disturbed mind, a man lost in the system, or someone we would never suspect? And perhaps the most unsettling thought: what if we were never meant to know? The killings stopped, but the mystery didn't. And sometimes, not knowing the truth is far more frightening than knowing it. Time moved on. The city healed, at least on the surface. Streets that once held fear returned to routine. People went back to sleeping under open skies. Vendors reopened their stalls late into the night, and Mumbai continued being Mumbai. But something invisible had changed. A memory. A quiet awareness. that danger doesn't always come with a warning. The victims of the Stoneman were not celebrities. They weren't powerful. They didn't have headlines written about their lives. Most didn't even have their stories told. They were people surviving one day at a time. People the world often looks past, and yet, their lives mattered. Their stories mattered, and remembering them is part of understanding the truth. The case exposed something deeper. Not just a killer, but a gap in protection, in awareness, in how society responds to those living on the margins. Because when victims are invisible, justice becomes harder to reach, and that's a truth far beyond this case. Over time, cities evolved, law enforcement improved, surveillance increased, emergency response systems became stronger. Today, it is far harder for crimes like this to go unnoticed for long. Not impossible, but harder, and that progress matters. Fear is powerful. It spreads quickly. It changes behavior, but it also teaches. It forces awareness. It pushes systems to improve. And in cases like this, fear became a catalyst for change, for vigilance, for responsibility. Beyond the mystery, beyond the theories, there's a human story. Lives interrupted, a city shaken, and questions that remain unanswered. But also, resilience, the ability of people to move forward, to rebuild routine, to continue living, even after fear. What does this case teach us? That danger doesn't always look obvious, that silence doesn't mean safety, and that awareness is one of the strongest forms of protection. It also reminds us to notice people, especially those society often overlooks, because safety should never depend on visibility. The identity of the Stoneman remains unknown. No confirmed arrest, no final answer, no clear motive, and that uncertainty is what keeps this story alive. Because some mysteries don't end with solutions, they stay with us as questions. A city that never sleeps once feared the night. A killer who left no trace, left behind a lasting impact. No face, no name, only a pattern, only a memory, and a reminder that even in the busiest places, silence can hide something dangerous. But today, the story is no longer just about fear. It's about awareness, about progress, and about remembering that every life matters, even the ones the world forgets.